Hey everyone, Brian here, coming at you with what was the biggest, longest con that the DM or players have ever pulled off in a D&D campaign. And if you'd like to tell us about yours, please do so in the comments below. When I started this campaign, I told my players their characters would die. A lot. I explained to them a homebrew mechanic that would be used, a sort of dynasty system. It was designed to be along the lines of clans in Naruto, so each player got to develop feats and skills that were unique to their dynasty. Homebrew spells, feats, and skills were heavily encouraged. This was again done by drawing on inspiration from Naruto, by making them like hidden jutsu, locked to the rest of the players. As a result, players became attached to their dynasties instead of individual characters. Individual characters would be influenced by their parents, and in turn, would influence their children. Instead of leveling by combat, players had to train their progeny to become more powerful. Any character that rolled 2 critical successes during creation would gain the progeny feat, boosting their stats, with a portion of the boost getting passed on. Players quested mainly to collect gold to improve their homestead and influence, improving their ability to train the next generation. Once the old character died, the kid took over. 4 to 5 quests was the average. The record was actually 12. The players wanted their characters to die so the next generation could take over. The bait was set. Over time, it became clear something bad was coming. As the dynasties grew in power and influence, they heard whispers of an immortal necromancer of absurd power. The tales they heard were quite outlandish, discounted as rumor and exaggeration. Occasionally, a player would encounter an unusually powerful undead that used eerily familiar techniques, but they never thought much of it. This is D&D. Undead enemies are practically bread and butter. That is, until a player created a progeny with high stats in both intelligence and wisdom that was also learned in history. This character recognized who the undead enemy was. It was his great-great-grandfather. Suddenly, the game changed. The players mustered all the strength they could, invested every bit of wealth they had, and scoured every inch of the world looking for the necromancer. They eventually found him, and he was easy enough for them to kill. He was a centuries-old warlock, but he had not aged well. He only had a single hit point, so he was no real threat to the players. The players slew him as quickly as you might expect. One even remarked that it was the easiest big bad fight they ever had. I told them they should have paid more attention to the legends they were told, because according to the legend, the warlock gained his power by making a deal with a demonic lord of the dead. He would be immortal until struck down by a righteous warrior. Now upon his death, his soul would become a bridge between worlds, allowing his armies to cross from the land of the dead to the land of the living, bringing with them the apocalypse. They realized they just made a massive mistake as an ethereal door opened in front of them with an undead army in front of them. But not just any army. The army was composed of every character they had played in the campaign. The players prepared for battle. They were the lords and masters of the lands, kings and archmages and high priests. Strength, power, and skill honed over a dozen generations. Their subjects and students were rallied behind them, ready to defend their home. Their enemy marched forward, seeking to reclaim the land that was once theirs for their new master. The players were successful in repelling the first wave and stood eager to receive the next. That is, until one player encountered an enemy he already fought. He asked one of the priests where the souls of the enemy were sent once slain. A successful roll later, the priest replied with a horrified look, "To the land of the dead." The players realized this was a battle they could never win. The enemy had an immortal army that grew with every slain combatant. They had to find a way to win a war without killing a single enemy. Well, they had one ray of hope. The Necromancer's Pact only allowed the demon's army to cross, not the demon itself. That could only happen if the dead conquer the living. In a stroke of absolute cleverness, one player asked, "Can the enemy die of hunger or thirst?" I replied, "No, they're undead." The player told his subjects to grapple every enemy they could, and for the mages to create chains around each enemy to bind them in the land of the living. Once bound, their tongues were cut out to prevent spells from being cast. It was brutal, but it was effective. A large contingent was left to guard the portal, with orders to immediately do the same to any who crossed. The player set out to find a way to allow the souls of the dead to pass on without being sent to the land of the dead. I started a D&D campaign when 3rd edition first came out. There was a very young red dragon in one of the very first adventures that I actually ran. It came from the Dungeon magazine. Back then, I tended to use a published adventure to start a campaign and then see where it went from there. This one took a dark turn that lasted decades in the game and years at the table. The PCs decided they had a better idea than killing the dragon and taking his stuff. They subdued the dragon and took its stuff. They then shredded its wings so it couldn't fly away. They tore out its teeth and claws so it couldn't hurt anyone. They tied it up and dragged it off to sell to a local mage for research. While held by the wizard, it was trapped in a tower behind wards. It was subjected to painful experiments and psychological torture. A creature that was genetically predisposed to be evil was given years of pain to stew in its rage. And, of course, it eventually escaped about a couple decades later. During those decades, the players ended up going to the plane where time ran differently. When they got back, 25 years had passed. The dragon had time to study the wizard's library. Using the advancement rules, it was now a young dragon and a wizard. Back then, we had a small group. There was usually a hole to fill in the party makeup, and 3rd edition worked a lot better with 4 characters. I usually ran an NPC healer type. Those characters had personality, but they're always team players. They tended to go with the flow unless something clearly went against their religion. Eventually, there was a hole in the party that needed filled. They needed a blaster. Enter the human wizard. He was still very much a team player. Lots of nukes coupled with the subdual spell feat, so he wouldn't kill the party. Of course, he was the polymorphed dragon. They adventured for quite a while, almost into epic levels. The whole time he was sitting, being party treasurer, tossing unused goods into his bag of holding, until the day they killed another dragon. The flashbacks it gave sent him into a rage. As soon as it was dead, he nuked the entire party. He only had subdual spells memorized, so they survived the surprise onslaught. His greed took over and he shoved everything they'd found, as well as lots of their loose gear, into his bag and teleported away. But not before he dropped a journal. For the year and a half of real time they'd spent adventuring together, I'd been keeping the dragon's journal. It was written on human flesh vellum and chronicled their journeys from the perspective of someone who hated them. He harped on every single mistake they made. He talked about having to keep himself from eating them many times, such as when the drunken master got turned into a rumsicle by an ice basilisk. I'd printed it out on thick paper, crumpled and re-crumpled the paper until it was super soft, and then put it in the oven to singe the edges. It took me several days to get it right. It took them forever to read through it at the table. The looks on their faces were priceless as they realized the monster they'd created and what it had done to them. That session, I started running a heavily modified version of Dragon Mountain, aka the quest to kill that bastard dragon and get our stuff back. Their revenge took them from 15th to 16th level all the way up to bumping against the doors of epic. This was quite a while ago, so the details will likely be less than precise. I believe we were playing 3.5. The campaign had already been running for a while, and I believe they were somewhere around 4th or 5th level. The party was en route from the point A to point B and had camped for the night. One of the early watches consisted of just one player watching while the others slept. A monster was creeping up on the party. The player on watch, let's call him Fred, was given multiple opportunities to detect this, but consistently rolled hideously low numbers, probably including one or more nat ones. The monster in question was a variant I had created for a doppelganger. The usual doppelganger can change shape and look like whoever it wants. Well, this one worked slightly different. In order for it to look like someone, it had to capture them. Then it would stuff them into a sort of magic psionic special pod. When someone was in the pod, the doppelganger would be able to mimic them perfectly. This would include most skills, powers, and mannerisms, as well as some memories. Not every memory, but it would know the names of the people it hung out with, etc. The idea behind the critter was simply that it wanted to fit in and have a life, but was hideous in its usual form. So it would take people's lives for as long as it could. The creature and the person in the pod would form a psychic link and live sort of symbiotically, with the pod keeping their body alive. Well, anyway, the advanced doppelganger had a mesmerism power that was pretty low grade that it would use to get you to not immediately attack or run away. The doppelganger snuck up on Fred and used this ability. Fred again fails to save miserably. The doppelganger subdues him and carts him away. The rest of the party is given multiple rolls to wake up all while this is happening. They also fail every roll. Off in the distance, the doppelganger stuffs Fred into the pod and sneaks back to the party, now looking like their friend, and tries to blend in. What makes this into a long con is that while I had everyone make all their rolls until somebody succeeded at something, I wasn't going to tell them anything. And as everyone completely failed at everything, nobody ever knew, not even Fred. From that point forward, he was a doppelganger. Only nobody besides me knew it. The players knew something had happened, but nobody knew what. Fred had some confusion, but all of the players couldn't figure anything out. They weren't in or near a town or city with any sort of temple or medical help, so they ultimately shrugged and continued on their way. Well, the game continues for several years. Ooh, the players never question anything. As I didn't make a big deal of it, neither did they. The exact instance sort of fell into the background. When something would happen that referenced something that occurred before the body swap, if Fred's player started to comment, I would say, you don't remember that, or something similar. Some of his more esoteric and rarely used abilities also would not work, but they were minor and generally unimportant. Occasionally, after something like that happened, one of the players would say something like, "We should really look into that at some point," but they never did. Much later, they are now dealing with whatever the current issue was. They had gotten sort of stuck as to what all the info in their possession meant, and they decided to spend the money on a commune spell, which in this edition lets you ask your deity a number of questions equal to your caster level. The party gathers their goal to be able to hire as high a level caster as possible to get the most questions as possible. They ask their questions about the current problems and, in an unusual turn of events, manage to quickly ask the right questions, such that they have all of the answers they need and questions left over in the commune. They waste a few questions on loose plot threads. Is person X in town Y? What person Z lying to us? Etc. They have a few questions left. Almost as a throwaway question, one of the other players asks something like, "Is the person in front of me actually Fred?" The answer is, of course, no. It quickly all unraveled after that. The doppelganger made a plea for his life. They beat it to a pulp. There was a mad rush to find Fred's actual body before the pod he was in died and he suffocated. The player of Fred was once again playing Fred, except now he had no memories of the time between the snatch and his being saved. The other players were so far ahead in levels that I had to fudge things and allow him to have leveled as well. Though, if memory serves me right, he did make a few changes, which seemed fair enough given what I'd done. For what it's worth, the player in question thought the whole thing was great and really enjoyed it. His wife was completely pissed at first. Honestly, that's a brilliant idea, one of the best ideas I've heard as a con in a game, so kudos to you. Hey everybody, Brian Von VA checking in after the vid. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, to ring that bell, and of course, to leave a comment down below letting us know what your biggest, bestest con was in a D&D session, or any TTRPG. That said, please be happy, safe, and healthy. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.